right. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy winter. So glad that you can join us today. Welcome to our morning coffee series. Um, my name is Matt Stinchcomb, and I'm one of the co-founders of Partners for Climate Action. For those of you who don't know, um, Partners for Climate Action started back in 2019 with the goal of moving multiple forms of capital to where they'd be most relevant, efficient, and effective in catalyzing local ecological action. At our core, we're funders who support grantee partners with knowledge, tools, and connections that they need to be successful. And mostly, we're really focused on this region and what are the approaches that most honor all the people and places here. So that's what we do. And we're very excited to have Anton Seimon back today. Dr. Seimon, who's based here in the Hudson Valley, leads research programs on diverse themes in the atmospheric and environmental sciences. He just reminded me that he was my climate science professor at Bard 8 years ago, which reminded me of just how old I'd become. Current projects for Dr. Seimon include classifying a new type of windstorm and developing warning systems for it, monitoring climate change impacts in alpine watersheds of the tropic Andes, and mapping surface airflow of high-intensity tornadoes. For the National Center for Atmospheric Research, he has served on the steering committee of the Community Climate Intervention Strategy Group, which works to develop interdisciplinary research on climate interventions, technologies to reverse climate change, to achieve a sustainable climate. Excuse me. A National Geographic explorer and six-time grantee, Anton is an active science education, developing content for the Society's education, television, print, and web media, and also served as a juror for the New York Wild Film Festival, and for the graduate program in environmental policy at Bard College. He strives to make global climate change understandable in Hudson Valley contexts in his climate science classroom. Anton, it's great to have you back today, and I'm going to pass it off to you. Just a bit of housekeeping. Please stay on mute throughout the presentation. There will be an extensive Q&A after Anton's presentation. So just paste your questions into the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll try to get to as many questions as we can or look for ones that are commonly being asked. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to you, Anton.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Matt. So great to be back. Thank you, Partners for Climate Action, for hosting me again here. Let's see if we can make the share screen work. I hope you are seeing a PowerPoint. And if so, will it let me now? I've got to move this power. Hold on one sec, please. It's not letting me. There we go. All right. Do we have a PowerPoint? You seeing it okay? Thumbs up? Good. Okay. Thanks. So today, I'll be speaking about the very local context of global climate change. That's, as Matt said, that's something I try to do in my classroom. Climate change is something that is typically talked about at these very broad scales and very abstract terms. Things are often framed in terms of, say, temperature rises, that type of thing. On the other hand, what we live and experience is extremely local, of course. There's a beautiful meadow in the picture. This is at Urm's Conservation Area, right here in Northern Columbia County. Beautiful thing to see. So I thought I'd start by showing this graphic, which is from the New York Times, and I'll revisit this graphic later on and others like it. The New York Times has had an interesting series of articles on home insurance over the last couple of years. And it's very revealing because if you look at this map, you see hotspots shown in red where homeowner insurance rates are skyrocketing. One area of the country that's not skyrocketing is the Hudson Valley of New York. Look at it. Look at New York State overall up here. And most of the Hudson Valley is sort of in these lightest shades of all. There's something desirable, you might say, in context of climate change about where we live. Thought that's something I'd make frequent reference to during the talk today. Meanwhile, places like North Carolina and Florida are those hotspots, California with its wildfires. You really can see the impacts that these recurrent disasters are having in these places. So, the state of the climate worldwide is pretty dire, as we know. I mean, the global temperature increases have been skyrocketing in recent years. The last 10 years are the 10 warmest years on record. 2023, by far the warmest year on record, was a step function increase. 24, only slightly better. But overall, we're seeing these patterns, and they are starting to have some very deleterious effects in all sorts of places. If you sort of map on a time frame, the temperature anomaly, the departure from normal, this is in degrees centigrade, going through time. If you look at these sort of early decades of the 20th century, even going back to the 1800s, you see all these sort of dark blue colors down here. And then as you progress through time to the present, this is running through October this year, it's just sort of phenomenal where we are compared to where we were in the past. But what does that mean in our local context? We also have climate change projections. This is a look at what climate models tell us, say, for the future of climate in the Hudson Valley context. This is just looking at our domain here. This is a collection of all the models utilized in these big IPCC reports that are issued every 7 years or so. So the most recent one, depending on the scenario you're looking at, very high greenhouse gas emissions, much lower, if there's global cooperation. Regardless of which scenario you look at, through about mid-century, about 2050, we are clearly just going to be trending upward as far as temperature goes. Precipitation somewhat upwards, but there's a lot of variability. Well, how do we make sense of this in our local context? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. A just published study came out looking retrospectively at historical observations going back to 1900, finds that one of the fastest warming places in the United States is New England, which we border, of course. And, this was just published last week. It immediately got picked up in the Guardian newspaper. New England warming faster than most places on Earth. The only place in the United States warming faster than New England, especially in winter, is Alaska. So we are kind of a hotspot of climate change. It's kind of strange to think of it that way. But in the course of the talk today, I'll try to make that understandable and see the impacts and consequences of that. So the most important takeaway, I have an overall message, and I repeat this at every public speaking opportunity I can, is to kind of demystify why we're so concerned about a warming climate. A warming climate on a day of a 0 degree morning like we have today in many places, or, it's 24 below zero right now in the Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks. It's an impressively cold winter morning. Who wouldn't want a milder winter, right? The problem with a warming temperature is not so much the temperature for the most part. It's really what it does then to the atmosphere's capacity to carry moisture and deliver moisture. So what happens is this relationship, which has a complicated name, but I just like to refer to it as the exponential increase in moisture as a function of temperature change. So 1 degree centigrade is 1.8 degrees of Fahrenheit. Globally, we've already seen 1.5 degrees of temperature increase since about 1900. So air masses around the world on average are holding about 10% more moisture now than they would have, say, 125 years ago. What are the consequences of that? Well, when water, you have a warm day, you can suck water into the air that much faster. Evaporation is increased. The flux of moisture from plants to the air increases that way. It also works the other way. When you have the heavy thunderstorms of the midsummer, they can deliver moisture more rapidly, and you have heavier rainfall and flash flood potential. Our geographic context of the Hudson Valley is very important. This is the topography. You can see that the Hudson River itself is right at sea level, but we're flanked by highlands on either side. In fact, there's a larger elevation difference right here in eastern New York State than you have in 24 US states, going from the summit of Slide Mountain and the Catskills all the way down to sea level. The snowfall accordingly responds, with lower elevations getting much less than we do in the flanking highlands. You also see things like patterns of ground fog here. This is a typical morning in September, where the valley can be cloaked with low fog and clouds, but the surrounding highlands are clear. We're a very well-watered environment. Average rainfall, this is from the National Weather Service products here. The whole region gets between 40 and 55 or so inches of rain. That's well watered, and it's very well distributed throughout the year. That's very favorable. We don't have, say, a prolonged dry season like you have in California that makes them highly susceptible to the wildfire outbreaks on a seasonal basis. Snowfall is very much a product of a function of elevation. I was actually amazed to see, this very detailed breakdown also produced by the Weather Service from all the observers around the region, that in the lower Hudson Valley here down, this is Dutchess and Orange counties down here, the snowfall along the Hudson River is only in the low 20s of inches a year, which is very dramatically different from, say, up in the Highlands. I'm sitting right here in Canaan, near the Massachusetts border, where we get close to 90 inches of snow a year. So a warming climate is going to have a profound impact on things like snowfall. It's reasonable to expect that. And the way that is experienced is going to largely be a function of elevation. So some of the changes by season that we'll see, and this is a slide I first showed, I've presented here before, from 2023. Much of this is still valid. I don't see any reason to change it. We see, especially the last two winters, a much greater fraction of rain coming in winter storms than snow. Like, the winters of our grandparents and great grandparents in this region really were much snowier on average. It's a very real thing. Well, when you have rain in winter, you also have the increased possibility of ice storms if you have sub-freezing conditions at the surface. And these pictures show, ice storms are incredibly beautiful in their aftermath. They're also incredibly destructive because trees get top heavy and topple onto wires, and we lose power for days. And, ice storms are a big problem. There's an overall trend in the 20th century, 21st century. We've seen many high intensity nor'easter storms. The last 2 years, they've been largely absent. I think this winter they'll be back in full swing. We'll already see, that's something, I found very interesting and exciting. But yeah, those storms can have impacts. They're milder temperatures overall. That's unquestionable. And I'll actually give you some numbers on that later. Lakes used to freeze and stay frozen for 3 months. That's certainly not the case anymore. I think we've all seen that. And overall, there's a sense that there's changing variability. Well, here's an example of a snowstorm, a huge snowstorm that occurred in the middle of March back just a couple of years ago in 2023. The flanking highland regions, look at these snow totals here are above 2 feet. These red areas, and some in Vermont here, even in some places getting more than 3 feet of snow. But look down here, Kingston, Saugerties, 0.1 inches. The same snowstorm that up here at my house delivered 31 inches, but it was a mix of rain and snow down there. And I would say that the same storm, had it occurred a century ago, probably would have put at least a foot of snow down in Kingston, that area as well. The warming climate is the difference there. We are really starting to see it. The storm would have been much more coastwise. These coastal areas, towards the New York City area, probably would have held on to the snow much longer before changing to rain. So we're seeing impacts like that. That's just on an individual storm basis. But I'm going to focus much of the talk today on the warm season hazards, because the warm season, the warmer months of the year, are when that temperature-moisture relationship really, really kicks in, and has very, very significant consequences. So overall, a warming climate, of course, the warmest days of the year over time should continually get warmer and warmer. We haven't yet seen extreme heat waves, say, over 100 degrees for several days in a row. What we have seen is overall increases in temperature and some really sort of long periods of hot, humid weather, and that is likely to increase. That is just a function of the overall warming of the climate. But consequences of that warming really get experienced hydrologically. We see this now in the way that we have been having these droughts. The last 2 years, starting in about August, going into October, early November, there have been serious droughts in the landscape with consequence. Those are just weather anomalies, sort of short period in some ways, but their recurrence is starting to get worrisome because they really, really have some consequences. We've seen our local ponds dry up. The water table has dropped so low that even though it's been quite wet the last 6 weeks or so, the ponds haven't actually refilled properly. We've noticed. So it's going to take a while for the water table to recover. The wildfire hazard is something I'm really going to focus on today because that is something that's going through the roof right now. We really are seeing that. And then the intensifying thunderstorm rainfall rates and that warmest months of those warmest months of the year, we are seeing recurrent flash flooding like we have not seen in the past. And that is entirely consistent with our expectations because of a changing climate. So I'd say I recently discovered severe flash flood hazard. It really kind of came to light starting in August of 2011 when the remains of Hurricane Irene moved up the coast. Now, we've had flooding events in the past. Of course we have, but they've been typically very well spaced. Wait till I show you how frequent they've become. It's really startling when you see what we're facing with right now. So this was a tropical cyclone, a hurricane moved up, weakened, but bringing copious amounts of rainfall. And the state of Vermont up here was particularly hard hit. In one night, Vermont lost 50% of their bridges, either damaged or destroyed by this widespread flooding that covered the entire state. Much of the Hudson Valley, the Catskills, there was also very significant flooding here. A couple of years later, Superstorm Sandy was more of a wind event and a high tide event, not so much a rain event. But then we've gone through a sequence of events. Yeah, late summer of 2021, two dying tropical cyclones moved up, Henri and Ida. 44 people died in the Northeast, eight of them in New York City. And look at these headlines from the New York Times, sort of a sequence of breaking news headlines that came through. This is 11:46 p.m. Flooding has all but shut down New York subway, rail service, flights halted. Faced with brutal flooding, this is a couple of hours later, a travel ban for New York City. The mayor declared a state of emergency. A few hours later, at least 8 killed. This is in New York City for flooding. Well, what happened? This is the rainfall rate, the maximum rainfall rate in 1 hour that was registered. Okay, this is from the network of observing sites in New York City. The value is as much as 4 inches of rain in 1 hour. Guess what? New York City's drainage system, all those storm sewers you see on the streets, they are engineered to handle a maximum of 1.75 inches in 1 hour. Well, those were 19th and early 20th century expectations of what the heaviest rainfall we're likely to see from the heaviest thunderstorm of the year. This is now routinely being exceeded, and sometimes by, multiple times over, as we saw. All of New York City effectively saw rainfall rates exceeding that. There was very widespread flooding that occurred when this happened. As my colleague Nick Bassel from the New York State Mesometeorological Network said, this is absolutely crazy. Virtually the whole city is coming in with these rates. This is just something we haven't seen in the past. 10th of July 2023, as it approached, I was looking at weather forecasting model output, and it was showing incredible amounts of moisture in the atmosphere coming up to the lower Hudson Valley, coastal New England, the New York City area. I looked at this is a product of the weather forecast models that actually quantifies how much moisture is in the atmosphere. And this was in the upper end that has ever been observed from all the weather balloon observations we have that go back into the 1940s. This is showing about 2.5 inches of liquid water sitting in the atmosphere in a vertical column. That just hadn't been measured before. Well, guess what happens that night? Boom, flash flooding, major flash flooding in the Hudson Valley. Vermont, the same thing happens. They wash out many of the bridges that are being repaired again. This type of thing. Historic floods trap residents, destroy roads. What does it actually look like in our own area? This is Cornwall, New York. Huge road washouts. Some of these took a year to repair, right? And Governor Hochul really, she put this out on Twitter then, and it said, make no mistake, this is our new normal. This is on that day, the 10th of July, 2023. We're the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last generation with a shot at doing anything about it. That truly is a very sound assessment. We're very lucky in New York to have very progressive and forward-thinking politicians with very good policies in place to deal with these things. 29th of September the same year, another New York City flood. 10th of July in Vermont, 24, another one. 14th of July, 25, another New York City flood. I'll also mention that on the 10th of July this year, Vermont had a flash flood on the 10th of July for the third year in a row. It's crazy what's been going on. So these things are really happening and they're recurrent. Another hazard we're really having to deal with is wildfires. When I first spoke to this group in 2023, I was conjecturing that this is something that we were likely to see, but I didn't expect it would really unfold as rapidly as it has. I first my eyes were open to this in November, driving across the old Tappan Zee Bridge. Hey, that's a forest fire near my house. I was living downstate in Rockland County at that time. I'm like, whoa, this is New York City suburbs. There's a forest fire? Really weird, but yeah, there'd been a dry period and things caught fire. Well, as I've been teaching my course at Bard over the years, I've started off drawing attention to the huge wildfires in California. And then the way maybe 3 to 5 days later, the smoke would drift all the way across the country and at high levels in the atmosphere would flow over and reduce visibility and kind of give us those milky skies. But this was very much a faraway threat that would have impacts that would be exported to us. But over time, here's 2023, things have rapidly changed. We are now getting major wildfire outbreaks in California and other places. The smoke is much more local and it's making its way to us. And then, we are having very serious reductions in air quality repeatedly now during warm season months. This is from that event on the 6th and 7th of June in 2023. Satellites monitored this, and the worst air quality in the country, in fact, probably among the worst in the world at that time, is right here over upstate New York. And they were triggering air quality alerts and people being advised to stay indoors. The major parks in New York City closed down for the day because saying that people should not be outdoors. The 7th of June, this is what it looked like from above. You see this really smoky air coming over, obscuring visibility, and this was, on the front pages of newspapers around the world, showing New York City looking red in the middle of the day because there was so much smoke in the air. Well, those are still fires that are actually, say, from Canada that are exporting smoke our way. The last 3 years in Canada are kind of unparalleled for, the amount of land that's been burned, the surface. And unfortunately, that seems poised to continue as things warm in Canada. Many of those great boreal forests are very susceptible to burning. Well, July 2024, we see the warmest month on record in upstate New York. Albany has its warmest month, all right, exceeding a record that was originally set in July, all the way back in 1887. Look at these announcements from the Weather Service in Albany. This is early November, okay? These are from oh, sorry, I don't seem to have the date here. But yeah, November 2nd. That's what it's saying here. These records were set. We were seeing 80-degree readings in early November last year. Guess what happened? Boom. This was a very dry spell with incredible warmth, and we had hundreds and hundreds of wildfires across the Northeast, including right here. This is Kent down in the lower Hudson Valley and in the Hudson Highlands, and around Great Barrington here. People we know, friends of ours, had to evacuate their houses because these wildfires were encroaching on them. So in 2023, I conjectured that this is something we would have to deal with increasingly in the future. I had no idea how close it was just being around the corner. The last hazard I'll highlight is sea level rise in the Hudson River. The built infrastructure along the Hudson River is simply not designed for the rising water levels. The Hudson is at sea level. It experiences tides all the way up to Troy, right? So as the sea level is rising globally, guess what? It is also rising along the Hudson River. When we think of it as a river, but really it's a river estuary. And over time, things like the Metro North and Amtrak train service will be increasingly interrupted. When a storm pushes a lot of water up the river, it'll be that much more impactful than storms in the past would have been. And I think those rail lines will eventually be destroyed. And that's not just the rail lines, but all sorts of infrastructure along the waterway like that, unless very expensive adaptation measures are employed to raise it, to protect it, do that type of thing. So what does this look like if you actually look at numbers? These are rates of global sea level trends since 1993. So they take tide gauge measurements all over the world, satellite-based measurements more recently, and we can see Now, these units are very small. They're millimeters, all right? So 100 millimeters is 4 inches. It'll give you an idea. Globally, since the 1990s, we've seen now about 5 inches of sea level rise, if you would, 120 millimeters. The problem is the rate of increase is going up. It's getting steeper and steeper. As more and more ice melts in polar regions and off mountain tops, that water goes somewhere. It goes into the ocean ultimately. The ocean, as it's warming, is also expanding very slightly. That is also acting to increase sea levels. This is a measurement actually from New York City at the Battery at the tip of Manhattan, going back to the 1850s. There's a lot of rise that has actually happened. Okay, it's more than a foot of sea level rise has happened during this time. And if you look at the end here, you can see it's steepening, it's increasing its rate. So that's the hazard we're dealing with on that side. So I mentioned these New York Times graphics on home insurance rates are wildly distorted. Here's why. The good news for us is that despite the hazards I've been talking about, relatively speaking, actually the Northeast is more resilient and more able to accommodate some of these climatic shocks over time. There are some things that are very favorable. We have high elevation terrain for, in much of the region. That's kind of tempers the heating that we would otherwise be experiencing. Florida is repeatedly being hit by these very strong hurricanes. Well, guess what? By the time they make it up here, they typically are large rainstorms. We don't have all the wind damage, the tidal damage that you typically see. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to try to put ourselves in this context and what this means, say, for property values over time, or what that's going to mean. And one of the messages I take home from this is that a lot of people are going to be looking at our part of the country as a very desirable place to move to. Over recent decades, there's been a huge migration from the north to the southlands. I suspect it's going to be reversing. It's going to be intolerably hot in many places. People increasingly want to move to more northern climates, places that actually are buffered more for climate change and its associated hazards. So that's something that we can look to. Last thing I want to quickly go through here, I want to leave lots of time for Q&A, so this will just be the last 5 minutes or so. We'll look at some of the superlative weather events of the past and prospects for comparative events looking forward. I want to give you some sense of, well, how big can storms get? How cold can things get? How hot can they get? What is the likelihood that we'll see similar conditions? So talking about heat, the greatest heat waves, despite all the warming we've been experiencing, strangely enough, was actually during the Dust Bowl years, during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Both 1934 and 1936 had exceptional heat waves in the Northeast United States. I'll point first to this weather map from the morning of the 9th of July 1936. There are low 90-degree temperatures at 8 a.m. that are being registered. Even in today's very hot, muggy, New York City urban area thing, we don't see 90-degree plus temperatures early in the morning. This was a truly exceptional heat wave and really something that the magnitude of we haven't experienced since. These are a selection of high temperatures here, where Albany is 102, I think it's an all-time record. Many of these places, New York City actually had 106 in this heat wave. That's their all-time record. The next day, much of the same thing, Baltimore, Maryland, 108 degrees. These are frightening values. These are very hazardous values. There'd probably be some human mortality if we had an event like this. The odds of exceeding these values, I think, in the next 10 years is probably quite high. I wouldn't be surprised if we had suddenly a heat wave comes along that pushes temperatures up, approaching 110 degrees in some places in the Northeast sometime in the next 10 years. That's just a consequence of what we're seeing. We're seeing in other parts of the country that have these heat waves just with no precedent coming in. Conversely, the greatest cold, look at these numbers from 1934. If you think this morning was cold, minus 10 degrees going south of New York City. A large contour here, minus 40 degrees in Vermont and New Hampshire. We haven't seen anything like this since 1994, the most recent time I've seen sort of a scattering of minus 40-degree readings in the Northeast. The warming winters have really, really been manifest, such that a morning like this today, where we think, wow, it's really shockingly cold outside, that used to be a much more typical winter morning if you go back, say, 150 years ago. And some of these values here are really quite stupendous. Albany was 20 below with a high temperature of -4 degrees. Give you another sense of things. This is the morning on the 9th of February, 1934, that New York City set its all-time record low of 15 below zero. You can't get a temperature below zero in New York City. We haven't seen that now in decades. Um, so the prospect of these cold values being exceeded over the next 10 years, I think impossible. That horse has left the barn. The climate is simply different now. We are not going to see an event like this. And I'd be very intrigued if something did come along that threatened it, but I don't see it happening. Interestingly, the greatest temperature drop we've seen on record was actually just 3 years ago. You may remember that Christmas cold front that came through. It was quite unbelievable. Came sweeping across. Unfortunately, there was a tragic blizzard in Buffalo where many people died because they were trapped in their cars and froze to death because there was so much snow and wind and extreme cold. Maybe this will be exceeded, but this was kind of a very extreme event and it's quite recent. Was it climate change related? I don't really see a connection, but possibly it was part of the intensifying variability we are seeing overall. The greatest windstorm was a long time ago, 1950. Unquestionably, this is perhaps the greatest East Coast storm we have on record overall for its various impacts. These values are incredible. Albany sustaining 50 to 60 miles an hour with gusts to 83 miles an hour. Newark, 108 miles an hour. This wasn't a hurricane. This was a winter-like storm that was exceptionally strong. There was widespread blowdowns. Forests were flattened in the Berkshires and Adirondacks from the storm. Very unlikely to see this again, but at some point down the line, we will see a recurrence of a storm like this. Climate change may intensify because warmer ocean waters may be an intensifying factor in that. The greatest snowstorm on record, blizzard of 88, unquestionably. This is an unbelievable event. Look at these snowfall values here up and down the Hudson Valley, exceeding 40 inches, peaking at 58 inches in Saratoga Springs. 58 inches, 5 feet of snow. Think of that. Amazing, right? No storm before or after has ever come close to this. Prospect of being exceeded over the next 10 years? Possible, unlikely. Finally, I'll talk about the deepest snowpack we've seen. Interestingly enough, I believe this was in 1996, when following the string of snowstorms, there was this great blizzard in early January, and Great Barrington recorded a snow depth of 62 inches. That's just an amazing to think about. 5 feet 2 of snow on the ground, on the level. Unfortunately, this was followed by a large magnitude warm rainstorm that caused catastrophic flooding. The earliest snowstorm we've seen on record, October of 87. I experienced this one myself in Albany, up to 2 feet of 22 inches of snow here in the Catskills. Sorry, 24 in the Catskills, 22 up here in the Taconics. And then the latest snowfall region-wide, there have been some later isolated snowfall events, but the 9th and 10th of May 1977, all over the Northeast. It's really unusual. Even New York City saw snow that day. Tornadoes, something very obviously a point of fascination to me. This was 1973 at Canaan, New York, passing right next by my house here, moving southward, killed 4 people, unfortunately, along Interstate 90 here. And then the Great Barrington tornado of 1995, which real like Midwest United States sized tornado tracking for 30 miles that we studied here. These things do recur in this region. They're rare, but they are recurrent. I'd say that, we probably will see another event of comparable magnitudes during the next 10 years. An important caveat about today's speaker, myself. I'm sorry, but the president says it accurately. Climate science is coming from stupid people. I'm so sorry, but I'll do the best I can to field your questions regardless. So thank you very much.
Anton, thank you. Very eye-opening and very distressing that our government thinks that this is a scam coming from stupid people. I'd say the opposite. Great. Well, there's a lot of questions in the chat. I want to get to as many as we can. I thought maybe we could just talk about some of these impending issues and dig a little bit more deeply into them. Starting with wildfire. Right. We know that there's, of course, risk just from air quality and smoke from wildfires elsewhere. But I'm wondering, are there adaptation or mitigation things that we can be doing now in anticipation for this, controlled burns, whatever they may be?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that this is something, I mean, we have to adjust to a new reality, which is kind of like we've just awoken to it. Um, my wife Tracy and I have gone around the last 2 summers clearing a lot of the undergrowth and the understory around our house. We live in a very forested area on a hilltop. We need to thin it out because there is a very real risk, especially in these, when you have a dry spell like this, that things could catch fire. Then if there is a fire, you create a buffer zone around your house that way. Don't count on a fire department coming there when every other property in the area is also going to be under threat. Um, we've got to perhaps start thinking more about building fire breaks, actually cutting down swaths of forest, making these large gaps like they do in the Pacific Northwest in places where fires have been recurrent. And we're like, oh, that's an eyesore on our landscape. We don't want that. But, the other consequence of having, the entire forest burned down is, of course, wildly unappealing as well. So I think some of the, tried and tested measures that have been utilized all over the place, in other environments where wildfires are, you know, relatively frequent occurrences, we have to start adopting some of those measures. Building houses with more fireproof materials, clearing trees in the immediate proximity of structures, things like this. You can have a fire and the structures can all survive as long as there's a sufficient buffer zone. Um, many of us like to be nestled in the trees, but you really have to think about the consequences in that worst case scenario, more and more about it. So I think that, yeah, there are measures can be taken in advance. The best thing is not to be complacent about it and just hope it's not going to happen here or not hope that it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Just because things can change so radically and so quickly. And we have one big dry year. I mean, last year was so eye-opening. I think at one point there was something like 436 wildfires going on concurrently that were being tracked. All right. Most of them relatively small and containable. But the big ones, when you have a really dry spell, the weather conditions that are promoting it, and then a windy, warm day, say in October, November, wow, it's really, really problematic. So that's the kind of thing that we are dealing with. Another thing is fire departments are trained to put out house fires and things like that. They're not trained to put out forest fires in this area for the most part. We need some training. We need some of the folks coming from out west and teaching us the right methods. And of course, our forest composition is different to western forests, which are largely conifers. So that type of expertise is also needed. So I think that this is something that we can adjust to, we can adapt to, but the best thing is to be vigilant and not complacent.
Thank you. One of the audience members asked about wildfire impacts on rain events. I'm curious if there's any correlation between wildfire and how that impacts precipitation or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, wildfires, of course, put massive amounts of particulates into the atmosphere, and we think that, oh, maybe that's like a form of natural cloud seeding. All that soot can actually then help rain form. The thing is, those particulates tend to be much larger than the tiny nuclei that form that raindrops form around. So it's not as clear that there's any benefit or conversely, I'd say an effect to decrease rainfall. The weather systems that produce rainfall are largely occurring quite independent of the presence or absence of smoke. So yeah, I think it's probably best to think of them as being relatively independent.
I'm curious too about winds. As we have increased winds, that's certainly an increase to fire hazard or spreading fires. There was a question around the tornadoes too. Sorry, I'm scrolling through all these questions to try to find it, but I'm just curious about heavy winds and outside of even tornadoes. Do you anticipate the same kinds of increases that you would see in these other areas?
So far, I would say that we're not seeing increases significantly in severe winds. I mean, windstorms, for the most part, other than tropical cyclones, which of course are very, warm season events, and um, yes, we are seeing obvious increases in the intensity of tropical cyclones, not in the number of tropical cyclones. Tropical cyclones, I mean what we typically refer to as hurricanes. Okay, um, we're not necessarily seeing that the number of storms globally is increasing. In fact, the last several years have been below normal. But the intensity of storms, the fraction of storms reaching the highest categories, the category fours, the category fives, that is very worrisome because there's really a very strong relationship to the sea surface temperatures. Sea surface temperatures are warming globally and in the tropics. And we are seeing storms that are very rapidly intensify and that are absolutely catastrophic. We had three of them this year out of the four major hurricanes, intensified extremely rapidly. There are only a handful of cases in the past that intensified as rapidly as any of these storms did. So that we'll continue to see. That also means that if a hurricane does make it up to our latitudes, comes all the way up to the northeast United States, it will probably be stronger than it would have been in the past as well. So yeah, we can expect increasing windstorm impacts from that type of event. But that'll be once or twice a decade, I think, typically, in those timeframes. Overall, a warming climate reduces the temperature gradient between the tropics and the polar regions. That is really what typically drives very strong winter type windstorms. So over time, there's reason to think, if anything, that maybe, some of those windstorms, those winter type windstorms may have slightly less intensity. I can't say we're necessarily seeing that yet, but I don't see much reason to expect that there's going to be much intensification of those events.
Great, thank you. A lot of questions around sea level rise. I remember from your class 8 years ago, uh, talking about one specific ice sheet in Antarctica or something, and if that would melt, we could have rapid sea level rise of 30 feet. Someone in the chat is talking about, if all the ice on land melts, we could see sea level rises of 200 feet. And then another person asking about, well, can we trust any of the predictions or models coming out of the federal government now? So I'm curious, when you talk about 5 inches of sea level rise, that could seem like no big deal. But obviously it is, and obviously a number of questions too around impacts on infrastructure, efforts being done to address those. I'm curious, what you're thinking in terms of sea level rise in the Hudson Valley and the kind of adaptation or retreat or what we could be doing now to better prepare for that.
Yeah. First, let me mention what you described as the West Antarctic ice sheet. There are recognized tipping points in the climate system. These are threshold values that if they are crossed, they're very hard. Things change to a different state. And as sea level rises, it tends to destabilize these massive floating ice shelves that surround various parts of Antarctica. Um, and they're problematic because if you liberate that ice that's right now landlocked, it starts floating on the ocean. It can drift to higher latitudes and melt very rapidly. And that kind of thing can have a very substantial effect on sea level rise. Then there's, of course, a positive feedback. The more the sea level rises, the more you destabilize the remaining ice sheets, and things rapidly start to collapse and break down. It would take, I mean, the mass of Greenland and the mass of Antarctica, there's so much ice there. You can melt it like crazy, but there's, hundreds and hundreds of years of ice melt sort of stored there. It's not going to happen overnight. We know that. But if it does accelerate even beyond, I mean, it is already accelerating. We are seeing the consequences of that. Now, what can we do about that sort of in our very local context? The you know, Coastal infrastructure is typically very well engineered. It's, huge concrete bulwarks against, storms and waves and that type of thing. And it was expensive to install. And if you want to actually change it, it's likely to also be very expensive. When you've got something like a train line, which they put at, say, 5 feet above the water level, because that was the expectation that we would never see an event that would, you know, be higher than that. You can really start understanding the vulnerability. Well, it's one thing to think of it with a big storm event with waves and, a tidal surge, but even that smaller incremental rise, the baseline state, once you start getting the water level rising, you get all those processes, the erosion, the starting to dissolve some things, some marine organisms establish, aquatic organisms establish and start breaking down the cement a little bit in different ways. Um, there's a sort of incremental corrosion that starts to occur as well that weakens structures as well. When we talk about these extreme flash flood events, it's very easy to identify the impact that they're having on waterways and undermining bridges. But the fact that simply the average summer thunderstorm these days is delivering more precipitation in a shorter period of time means that we're starting to see erosion patterns changing on existing infrastructure as well. That may not be as apparent as, say, when you have the big catastrophic event, but over time, there's like a corrosion and a weakening, undercutting of a road, an embankment. I'm seeing it even here. There road cones set up on Route 9 here in Columbia County because one of our streams has now undercut the road and the road's in danger of collapse there. That type of thing. That's just one curve on one road. Multiply this hundreds of times over many places all around where we live. You can see that the infrastructure itself is going to have to be updated and hardened to adjust for these realities. Most of the engineering that we've inherited and that we live with, be it from storm drains and sewage systems to culverts to drain water to bridges, they were engineered with expectations of a 19th century climate, not a 21st century climate. Guess what our reality looks like? That's what we have to deal with.
Yeah, that's another interesting point too. There's a number of questions around climate migration, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. But what you just mentioned around our infrastructure, also very eye-opening, right? We have in many of our river towns combined sewage and storm water systems. There's 100,000 people that drink the Hudson River. So, we're seeing with these increased storm events a lot more contaminants going in there, but also as we have influxes of climate refugees and people, we also lack the infrastructure to support higher density housing or whatever it may be. And I'm just curious what you've been seeing, if any, research around migration trends and how they might be felt here, climate migration specifically.
Yeah, the term climate migration and climate refugees is often applied, say, more in developing country contexts where poor people get displaced because, consider a country like Bangladesh, 150 million people living in a country about the size of Wisconsin, right? Well, most of that country is extremely low lying. And as the sea level is rising, people are being displaced. They have to go somewhere, right? We think of that, and that can create geopolitical tensions and cross-border, illegal immigration and those things. But guess what? All of us in our own different ways can feel things as well. Some of those same pressures, like some people are throwing in the towel in California, saying it's not worth dealing with the wildfire risk. They loved living up in the mountains and the forests, but there have been so many destructive wildfires, say, over the past decade or so. It's just that at some point you say, what alternatives are there? Similarly, the mass migration to Florida, I expect has ended. Okay. I think there's going to be a mass flux out of Florida increasingly because the hurricane hazard is just becoming intolerable. Every year there is some other, you know, new stress that's coming along and people are being displaced. And the insurance industry is leading the charge here because they are not insuring coastal property anymore. Good luck at getting property insurance if you actually live right on the coast in Florida. Well, are you willing to finance the rebuilding of your house that's been destroyed only to know that 5 years down the line another hurricane may come and destroy it again? All right. So absolutely one can expect this type of thing to happen. There are other parts of the country, and there's been a huge flux of people into Texas and all that. Texas has now got a 5 month long warm season, which is really intolerably hot. Starting in April and going all the way, to well into the fall months. They have recurrent heat waves, and it's not pleasant. Yes, you can live in an indoor air-conditioned environment, but why would you? Move uphill, go somewhere or move north. So I think that we're going to see a lot of internal rearrangement, say within the United States and even internationally, and to some degree, people seeking places where they feel safer and more stable. One thing that's very curious, in the last week, there's been a flurry of activity talking about the Zillow real estate listing company that many people look at online and buy houses through them. They had a climate risk index. They actually took in the numbers, assessing a property, giving it a ranked scale of how susceptible it is to things like floods and wildfires and all that. Well, they've pulled that because, from various, lobbying interests are saying, that, that's inappropriate to do, and you're affecting the value of our houses and things like that. Well, those assessed risks are just based on algorithms that are done on sort of on massive levels. And an amusing anecdote, I looked at one of these companies that does this risk assessment type of things a couple of years ago. It ranked all 50 states according to climate-related risk. The number one safest, best place to be, it said, is the state of Vermont. Vermont, which has had three catastrophic floods on the 10th of July the last 3 years. Okay. With enormous damages, enormous damages. And it's like, how did they get it so wrong? Well, guess what? They weren't looking at that metric. So you really, to simply generate an algorithm and expect it's going to give you a meaningful result, you've really got to understand, well, what goes into that algorithm. It really has to be interpreted. And guess what? The climate experts, we may be stupid, but we sometimes are useful. So, actually, it may not be a bad thing to weave in people with expertise on, climate related hazards and actually have them be very much part of the conversation for assessing things like this.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's, the point you just made in many ways is that there's really no place on Earth that is going to be, immune from the impacts of a changing climate. That's for sure. And it speaks to the fact, something that at PCA we've always felt really, that connection and relationship is probably the most important thing if you're trying to foster resilience locally, right? You should know your neighbors. You should actually start to invest in these relationships and thinking about how we can best support each other through these increasing impacts and stressors that we're going to experience. And what someone asked in the chat around, how do we talk to people about climate change, right? How do we actually, recognize that for pretty nefarious reasons, there's large parts of the population that think climate change is a hoax, or think that, it becomes an instantly political issue when it's really not. We're just talking about a habitable community. So, in our last couple of minutes here, I'm just curious if you have suggestions or advice. How do you talk to people that think you're stupid, to quote the president?
Yeah, the so-called climate skeptics. I welcome conversations with any and all, absolutely, because typically I'll find that we have more in common than we have in differences. And it's a matter of, think first, of bringing out those commonalities and finding what we agree upon. Okay. The other thing I point out is nature doesn't care what your politics is. Okay. Nature's going to steamroll over people who deny things. All right. So I'm empathetic towards them, and I'm sorry that when bad things happen to people who may have good intentions but got some bad ideas on that, or malformed ideas, you might say. Um, it's a question of, I would much rather see them instead of being oppositional as people who can actually be persuaded. Okay. Just show them the data, show them the evidence, explain the processes, see what we can agree upon, then say, okay, what actually does a sensible policy look like based around that? Or do you really not want to clear the vegetation around your house because you're so convinced that this is nonsense? I wish you'd like, that kind of thing. So it's that same wake-up call that people in Florida have been experiencing when, you know, well, why would the insurance companies all leave? Okay. On one hand, it's Wall Street's best interest to kind of, block their ears and, say keep burning fossil fuels for the short-term profit and the hell with the long-term consequences. Well, the insurance companies are very interesting. Okay. They believe in climate change. And guess what? They always have. They've got things called catastrophic risk models that they run routinely. The US Department of Defense in the Trump administration also runs catastrophic risk models and things. They really understand these things like that. And they have to act accordingly because their job in both cases is really about defense. Okay. Um, so, the economic marketplace or the national security marketplace, they both are sort of responding to realities that are quite outside of whatever, political agendas is at work at the moment. So look at those things more than what somebody on standing on top of a soapbox and yelling loudly is saying, and really try to make sense of things in that light. And then look at the evidence. What is actually happening? What are we actually experiencing? And the whole purpose of my talk today is just to help people see those things that are happening all around them. That, it may be a news story for 48 hours and then it's gone. And then 6 months later, it seems to be a similar news story, but, try to connect the dots and really understand things that way.
Um, well, we are just about at time. I want to thank everybody for coming today, and thank you, especially Anton, for sharing this presentation with us. There's a lot of really good links that have been placed into the chat. We will send a follow-up out with the slides and a recording of this conversation, as well as some of the links that are in there. There's a lot of questions around funding and research. People posted links to those funding sources and to some of that research and some of those tools. So I encourage you all to look into that chat. And we're taking a winter break for the rest of the season from the morning coffee. So we'll be back, morning coffee series. So we'll be back in touch when we have our next one scheduled. But again, thank you all. If you feel so inclined, we're always looking for supporters at Partners for Climate Action. So Climate Action HV. We appreciate you all very much. And Anton, thank you again. And we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Cheers, everyone. Thanks.